Guess who's sick? Sick again. It is me. Instead of tea today, I have a ginger, lemon, and honey concoction in here, or sachet. So cheers to that.
Cheers to that. I'll have to get some if this cough gets worse, but
Yeah, I will
we
try
push
not to
through.
cough on you, okay? Or sneeze on you, rather.
Don't sneeze on me either. Yeah. All
Alrighty,
right.
yeah,
Are
but
we ready to get this party started?
we do. Wait, let me take a sip. Let's do this. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Tea and Tales podcast. I'm Now.
And I'm Sarah. We want to send a shout out to all the people who have been sending us kind notes, putting wonderful comments, and bumping our podcast up. We thank you so much for your support and your love, especially to Claire Draycott. You are always our best fan. And to Jessica Lathrop, all the way over in Spain. We appreciate you.
I have been waiting for this episode for the past 3 episodes. It has been a long time, okay? And I'm so excited because today I'm going to be, I almost want to say, interviewing Sara. So, as some of you might know, hopefully all of you know, otherwise you haven't listened to our previous episode. I'm a romance writer, and Sara is a fantasy writer. And as much as I know about fantasy, I know nothing about fantasy. So we thought it would be fun to talk a little bit about what the fantasy genre is. If you are a fantasy writer or a fantasy reader or a fantasy fanatic, this episode is for you. We would love to have your comments on this because maybe you know something else I don't know about fantasy or Sara doesn't know about fantasy. I want to start out by asking you because I know I just always say fantasy because I'm like, I'm going to read some fantasy. And then you told me, no, I write epic fantasy. And I'm like, chillax. Sara, chill your guava. Don't try to be so classy about this. Like, it's fantasy, my friend. And you're like, no, there's a difference. So what is the difference between fantasy and epic fantasy?
Well, there's a lot of differences in the fantasy genre altogether. Epics can be anything that's wide scale. It has a worldwide, a universe-wide stakes to it. The two main separations are high fantasy, also called second world fantasy, and low fantasy. High fantasy / second world fantasy and low fantasy take place in very different environments. Your low fantasy takes place on Earth with Earth things that we know. For example, you'll have your setting be New York, or your setting will be Old England. Where high fantasy, on the other hand, takes place on a completely different world. It can have completely different rules. You have to learn new places. Everything is different. And how high of a fantasy it is depends on how much you break away from things we know on Earth.
Okay. So that's where the episode where we talk about I'm a writer and you tell me about you're a fantasy writer, of course you do all this research about plants and all those things. That's where they come in handy because you kind of do need those things to be able to be like, is this Earth worthy or should this be outer space worthy?
Yes.
I don't know if it is the same, but for romance, you have the romance genre, but then you have subgenres of romance. You have contemporary romance, you have historic romance, you have paranormal romance, etc. Is it the same with fantasy, or is it just fantasy, epic fantasy?
It's absolutely the same. You can have fantasy that's more paranormal versus your typical high fantasy that has dragons and knights and shining armor, things like that. You also have dark fantasy that include a lot of horror elements. It's meant to shock you. It's meant to give you that fearful feeling. It's a huge genre with many different subgenres in it. There's even subgenres to the subgenres. So it can get very complicated. That makes your research into agents more complicated. It makes trying to pinpoint exactly what your comps are more complicated. Because if I'm writing a fantasy that's more Harry Potter with your wizards and your typical dragons in a contemporary Earth and low fantasy environment, or am I comping something more like Brandon Sanderson, where I've recreated an entire world and not even the species on it look like your normal elves and things?
Sounds like a lot of work, and thank goodness I don't write fantasy. I was reading a post, and then someone's like, "Yeah, I'm writing a space opera, and I would like some beta readers for this and this and this." And I'm like, "Space opera?" I was like, "Is this like a musical of space, but sung in opera?" So is it?
No.
That's very
So space opera,
disappointing.
the most popular space opera is Star Wars. A space opera is closer to the sci-fi than it is to fantasy. Space opera is more in the sci-fi arena because you're going to be in outer space dealing with politics from different worlds. You might have some science that mixes with space
Gotcha.
wizards. An opera has to have is it has to be on a galactic scale, emphasizes space warfare, uses melodramatics, risk taking, space adventures. So you're talking things that
Gotcha.
bring up a lot of emotion.
Okay. Well, that is good to know. I'm sad that there's no singing in it though. Can we talk to someone about this? Because well, okay, you also say okay, but so here's the thing though. You say when you write a specific fantasy genre that it makes it hard to find agents because of the specificity of it. Do you find it though harder to find agents for epic fantasy rather than just general fantasy?
I would personally say yes, but also with the caveat I still have a list of 100 agents.
Oh,
There's
okay.
a lot of agents out there. But I have to be careful with those 100 agents because I have a list of maybe 10 who specifically say, love your epics, love anything high fantasy. It really is a niche to be in the high fantasies. You'll find agents who will specifically say, I will not take a second world fantasy, which cuts me completely out. They don't want to relearn how the world interacts with their characters. They want to be in a world they understand. The other trick is you'll find people who'll say, I love epics. I do not like certain tropes. That's where a lot of people end up self-publishing in epic fantasy rather than traditional publishing because the trends that the agents and the publishers are looking for is away from your European based. They want to see elements from other cultures. So if you bring in something like genies from Egypt, there's actually a book that does this. It's a really good book, by the way. It's called The
Okay.
Master of Jinn by Djeli Clark. I'm probably butchering their name, where it's all about it's Egypt and Egypt fantasy. So if you write from a culture that is not European, not United States, and you write in your fairy tales and your mythology, that's hot right now. That's what people are looking for. If you're low fantasy, you have to get into those new cultures. And if you're high fantasy like me, you have to be creating cultures that are not based off of Europe.
So basically, what you are telling me is you are moving to South Africa to come and live with me so that you can write a fantasy novel. Or what I'm also hearing is now I have to start writing fantasy. Because clearly, I
Yes.
mean, I know everything about South Africa. We have such culture. I mean, we have 11 official languages to start with. Well, speaking of tropes, though, so I definitely have my favorite tropes and my least favorite tropes in romance. What
Mhm.
about you? Do you have like least favorite tropes or like your most favorite tropes that you tend to use?
I have three that I avoid like the plague.
Oh wow, just immediately three. You're just like, you know what? Every
Just
day when I wake up,
immediately.
those are the ones I think about immediately. I'm like vengeful about them.
Yeah, these are the ones that I break every time, anything that I write. The first one is your typical taverns, medieval times, pseudo European, like I just talked about. I think it's very cliche. There are people who enjoy reading it. I understand that, but I feel like there's so much more that can be done outside of that environment. I do bring in some medieval technologies. If they are outside the norm enough, then I'll bring it in because it's like, hey, there's another side to this. The
Yeah.
second one that I avoid like the plague is the idea of an evil overlord or the black and white morality.
Like either like you're good or you're bad.
Yes. I like having the spectrum. Evil people, I want you to like them. Love
Hmm.
my bad guy is my idea. I want you to sympathize with them in some way. You will understand them as a person and
Yes.
see that they have more depth than just doing things that are mean for people for the sake of doing mean things. They have reasons for it.
I love that you say that because one semester I took an acting in film and television class, and the professor showed us a film called The Last King of Scotland. And it is about the president of Uganda. And she was like, okay, as you're watching the movie, you have to kind of analyze the characters and see what they're doing and how they are. And naturally, this president is the antagonist in the story. But she was like, okay, from an actor's perspective, you can't just hate the character. You have to love the character for other people to hate the character and for other people to understand the character. So you need to understand that the even though the person is an antagonist, the way he thinks, he doesn't think he's a bad person. And that just like blew up a whole new world for me because I was like, that was so well said. And it was so good in a sense because I was like, I could use that on actual people in my daily lives. I was like, I don't know what you're doing right now, but I understand.
Yes, exactly. And I love it for the redemption arc. Because if you
Mm,
have an evil person, quote unquote, who has reasons for what they do, and you're able to dismantle that through the story and give them a redemption arc, it gives so much more depth to this idea of good versus evil than black and white idea of this person's
100%.
always good, this person's always evil. But you can also play with your people who stay evil where they miss that moment of redemption. And
Mm,
that adds depth to your story.
I 100% agree with that. Even though as a reader,
Absolutely.
sometimes I'm like, why did you make me like this person? I can't even with you.
The third one that I dislike is the
Mm,
idea of a never progressing world. This is where
okay.
you have a world that's just stuck in an era. And even if it goes 50 years, 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, they never progress.
I mean, even in real life, literally, if you look at 1990 versus now, there's a ton of difference. So yes, I absolutely agree that your world does need to progress, even if it's in the slightest way, because you want to show that this is a strong community and they have certain rituals and they have certain ways of doing things in certain cultures. But whether it is in small ways, like one day you ate with your hands and now you eat with a spoon, or it can be major ways, like now you have Wi-Fi. Yay. Okay, and then of course your favorite tropes, hit me with them.
I love the reluctant hero and the chosen one, but the chosen one has to have a twist. It can't be your typical chosen one trope. It
Yeah,
has
that's
to
the thing.
do something interesting.
I was like, I always
I,
feel that's always the character I get when I read it, so I'm kind of over it, but I'm glad you love it. Good on you.
I love it if it's new. You got to give me
Okay,
something different with the
different.
chosen one. They can't just
Like,
be magically be able to do everything suddenly. There has to be depth to them and reason and some twist.
she has a South African accent.
Not
Hmm.
just enough. Interesting character build. I'm saying, for example, my chosen one, she's really good at doing what she does without realizing it, but she still needs that mentor to guide her along, and she can't do everything. She comes to a point where she realizes I don't have to force myself to do something because I'm the chosen one. I can let
Ooh, I
somebody
like
else
that.
do that and stick to what I love and build this community around me.
I like that. She's delegating. She's like, you do that because you are better at it than I am. So
Mhm.
you do that. And I will be
Yes.
here. eating a cupcake. Any other favorite ones?
I love, we talked about this already, protagonist turned ally, that redemption arc. Give me a beautiful redemption arc any day. I adore it.
I feel, we all start loving a certain type of book or type of genre. And naturally, when we become writers, we do write in specific genres. Do you have any favorite fantasy authors?
I want to talk about 3 today, not just because I enjoyed their writing, but because of the inspiration that they've given to me. The first one is Brandon Sanderson. I've talked about him before. The biggest reason is if you go to his website, he has, here's my formula for creating a magic system. Here's my formula for doing this. And it's moldable. So it walked me through when I was creating my first series, how to build my magic systems so they made sense to people.
I love that.
How to
I
write
love
them.
when writers share things with other writers, because I think that is what being an artist and a writer is all about. It's like finding inspiration from other people and then just doing your own thing.
Brandon Sanderson he's a professor. He teaches creative writing. He has allowed the audio visual students to come in and record his teaching sessions. So you actually can listen to his full course, or almost his full course. He will cut some of them out if there's a guest speaker who doesn't want to be recorded.
Yes.
And you can basically take the classes on YouTube.
Just because he's a fantasy writer doesn't mean people who write in other genres can't benefit from those videos and those lectures.
The other person is N.K. Jemisin. I think you would love reading her. She's a high fantasy, but she's spicy. But the reason I enjoy her is because she has a class on Masterclass. She gives you homework. She gives you worksheets. She gives you all kinds of things on her particular masterclass. And she takes a very different perspective. I was able to get a good round view of world building, character building, story building. She rolls in a lot of self experience and history into her high fantasy, so you can see a lot of parallels into the real world in her plot lines.
Oh. And you said there was a third one?
So there's a third one. Her name is Andrea Stewart. And the reason why I like Andrea Stewart, she does twists on tropes well. I enjoy listening to her when I'm world building or editing, because she gives me inspiration on what I'm doing.
Ooh, I like that. I like that. And I think just because you want to be different doesn't mean you have to be like the extreme opposite of what everybody else wants. Like, you can take a normal trope and just a little twist on it can make it completely different and completely new to someone else. So I think maybe I should read some of her novels. I feel like I have learned so much. It's insane. And I hope and feel that our listeners have learned just as much. If you have any more fun facts you want to teach me about fantasy, you are more than welcome to leave all your comments all over the world, but especially on Apple Podcast, and give us 5 stars, because then we can go up to the top and you can keep listening to our podcast.
This might be one of our longer episodes, but we want to get you motivated to put your pens back to the paper, put your fingers back on that keyboard, and keep writing.
Yes, and if you want to join our lovely community that we have here, please go and follow us on Instagram at 10 Tales Podcast, on Facebook at 10 Tales Podcast, and on Twitter /X at Podcast T Tales. And we want to thank you again so much for everybody who has supported us so far. And we would love all of your comments and all of your shares to be contributed to the real world, not the fantasy one, please.
Have a great day.